I first heard about him when I wandered into the oldest part of our town, where the shadows of crumbling buildings stretched longer than the day itself. They called him the man in the cage, though I didn't know much else at the time. People whispered about him, mostly in hushed tones, as if speaking louder might make his story come alive again. The cage itself was enormous, a twisted mesh of iron bars that rose high into the air, long abandoned now, rust eating through its surface. But back then, the cage was not empty. Long ago, it had held a man whose name was slowly fading from history. And the more I learned, the more I realized that his life, strange as it was, had something important to tell, something about freedom, fear, and the way people can vanish into nothingness while still leaving a trace. He lived centuries ago, in a time when kings and rulers still liked to make examples out of people in ways that would seem cruel to us now. But even back then, what happened to him was different. He wasn't a criminal in the usual sense. No one accused him of stealing or murder or treason. The story says he was a wanderer, a man who knew too much about too many things. Some people said he had seen the edges of the world, had traveled to cities that only existed on maps no one else had, and had spoken words that made the rich and powerful nervous. Whatever the reason, one day, he disappeared from the streets, and the next thing anyone knew, he was locked inside that giant iron cage. I tried to imagine what it must have been like. The cage wasn't just a prison, it was a stage. People would come from miles around just to stare. There was no roof, so he could see the sky, but the sun burned him during the day, and the rain soaked him at night. He had no company except for the occasional soldier or guard who brought him food, and he had to eat in front of the crowd. There are stories that say he would speak sometimes, telling riddles or reciting poems, though most people claimed he mumbled nonsense. But in the way stories survive, I like to believe that he was speaking truths people weren't ready to hear. The town benefited in strange ways from him being in the cage. Merchants sold snacks and drinks to the curious. Children dared each other to touch the cold bars, though most ran away screaming. The cage became a symbol, though no one agreed exactly what it meant. Some said it was a warning, do not wander too far. Do not speak too loudly. Do not know too much. Others said it was a miracle, look at him. Even locked up, he survives. Even locked up, he is human. What haunted me the most was that no one seemed to remember how he got there. Stories conflicted. Some said he had been caught trying to reveal secrets to the wrong person, maybe even the king himself. Others claimed he had been chosen by a mysterious council of elders who wanted to test the limits of human endurance. Whatever the truth, the cage became his world. And in a way, it seemed he accepted it. I read accounts that said he spent hours drawing strange symbols in the dirt with a stick, symbols that no one could understand. He sang quietly sometimes, songs that sounded both sad and defiant. At night, when the moon rose over the town, he would lie against the cold iron bars, staring at the stars, and some claimed they saw tears on his cheeks. I imagine him like a shadow in a storybook, small and fragile but impossible to ignore. They say he survived in the cage for many years. People came and went, guards changed, rulers died, but the man remained. Some visitors wrote letters, describing him as a human monument, a man who endured without complaining. Others said he was a ghost pretending to live, that he was half alive, half imagination, and that people's eyes could only see what their minds wanted to see. Even now, centuries later, the cage still stands. Rusted, bent, and cracked, but still standing. And I think about him when I pass by, about what it must have been like to live in that tiny space, to have the world staring at you, wondering what you are, wondering if you were sane or mad. I wonder if he had dreams of escape, of running through forests and sleeping under trees without anyone watching. Or maybe, in some strange way, the cage became his home, and the people outside, his family. There is a story that the man kept a journal, but no one ever found it. Some claim it was thrown into the river by a guard who didn't understand the words. Others say it is still hidden, buried beneath the stones of the town square, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. I like to think about what he wrote, because maybe, in those pages, he explained why he endured such a life, why he accepted the cage. Maybe he wrote about freedom, about fear, about how the human spirit can survive in even the strangest circumstances. I cannot know for sure what he thought. History does not record it clearly. It only gives us pieces, the cage, the rumors, the strange drawings in the dirt. And yet, these fragments tell a story stronger than any ruler's decree or any soldier's sword. They tell of a man who lived differently, who lived and suffered and maybe even thrived while others watched. I keep thinking about him because there is something important about watching life from the outside, about learning to survive in a world that doesn't understand you. Maybe that is why his story has lasted longer than any law, any war, any king's memory. Sometimes, when I stare at the cage, I imagine him whispering from the shadows, telling me a secret meant only for those who listen carefully. I imagine him laughing quietly at the absurdity of life, at the way people believe they can control others with walls and chains. I imagine that he finally walked away, not by breaking the cage, but by letting the cage release him in a way no one else could understand. And in that thought, I feel a strange comfort, as if the story of the man in the cage is not just about suffering, but about something more, something that belongs to anyone willing to look and see, to imagine and wonder. And so, the cage waits, the man waits, and I wait too, hoping to uncover the next part of his story, hoping to find the truth behind the whispers, hoping to understand how someone could live a life so different from everyone else's, yet leave a mark that refuses to vanish. He spent his days in the cage in ways that no one could truly understand. People think that being trapped in a space surrounded by iron bars would crush a person's spirit, that it would turn him into something smaller, something less than human. But the man in the cage became different. He adapted. I can almost see him in my mind now, shifting the few belongings he had, sitting on a rough wooden plank that served as a bed, leaning against the bars to watch the sun move across the sky. Time must have felt strange to him. Days, months, years, each one a repetition, yet each one different because the world outside never stopped moving. The people came and went. The guards changed. Seasons turned. And still, he remained. He learned the rhythm of the town outside his prison. In the mornings, children would gather near the edge of the square, daring each other to touch the iron bars. He would lean down to meet their eyes, and they would scream and run away, though some brave ones would linger, hiding behind pillars or crates. Merchants would open their stalls, shouting their wares and laughing at the curious crowd. The man would watch it all, silent, observing every gesture, every expression. Some said he memorized faces, names, even the patterns of people's movements. I like to imagine that he knew the life of the town better than anyone who actually lived there. At night, when the square emptied and the world quieted, the man would speak softly to himself. Sometimes he whispered poems, sometimes riddles, and sometimes, according to the old accounts, he sang in a voice that was strange and haunting, like the wind over empty hills. Guards would listen from a distance, some taking notes, others shaking their heads in confusion. They didn't know if he was mad or wise. The people who visited rarely stayed long enough to hear the whispers. But there was magic in it, I think. Magic in someone who could survive isolation, who could create beauty from confinement, who could exist in a cage and still feel the pulse of life beyond the bars. He found ways to entertain himself, small acts of rebellion that might seem silly but must have been essential for his sanity. He would fashion little toys out of scraps of wood or bend wires into shapes. He would trace patterns in the dust with a stick or his fingers, symbols no one could decipher. Some visitors claimed they were maps to hidden treasure, secret codes for lost knowledge, or even messages from the gods. Others said they were just the idle scribbles of a lonely man. I like to believe they were something more, though proof that he refused to let the cage define him entirely. Food became an exercise in patience. Every morning, a guard brought him bread, water, sometimes meat, but always in small portions, as if to remind him that he was not free. The man ate quietly, never wasting a crumb, never throwing anything away. Some stories claim that he would offer a piece of bread to birds that came near, or to stray cats that circled the square. Perhaps it was a way to keep a connection to the living world outside his iron prison, to remind himself that kindness could survive even in confinement. And then there were the people who came for other reasons entirely. Nobles, merchants, travelers from distant lands. They would arrive in the square, paying for the privilege of staring. They brought coins, gifts, and sometimes small books or scrolls. They wanted to see the man, to test his mind, or simply to gawk at a curiosity of the town. The man rarely spoke to them unless he chose to, and when he did, his words could be sharp, even cutting, or they could be strangely gentle, like a teacher speaking to children. Some said he had knowledge of the world that none of them had, secrets about places they had never seen or events they could not explain. But they never wrote down what he said, or if they did, the records were lost to time. Despite everything, he found moments of laughter. Small things: a bird landing on the bars, a child tripping over his own feet, a sudden gust of wind that sent papers flying. These moments were fleeting, but they must have been precious, because they reminded him that he was still alive, that he was still human. And he would smile at the absurdity of life, even while trapped, even while the world outside treated him as a spectacle. He had no companions in the usual sense. No friends, no family, no one to share a proper conversation with. But he had visitors who mattered, in ways that history may not fully record. There was an old woman who came every week, carrying a basket of herbs and bread. She didn't speak much, but she would nod at him, and he would nod back. Some say she understood him in ways no one else did. There was a young boy, perhaps no older than I am now, who would leave little drawings pressed between the bars for the man to find. The man would smile at them, sometimes leaving marks beside them, small replies that only the boy could understand. These connections, though tiny, must have been lifelines, proof that he was not completely cut off from humanity. The harshest part, I think, was time. Imagine seeing everything change, hearing the same stories repeated over and over, watching generations of people grow old while you remain in one place. Some days, he must have felt invisible, forgotten by the world. Other days, he must have felt like a monument, the living memory of a story too strange to vanish. And yet, he endured. Some accounts say he developed a strange peace, a patience that almost seemed unnatural, as if he had accepted that life would continue, with or without him. But life in the cage was not without fear. Sometimes soldiers arrived in the night with orders from rulers or officials, men who had no interest in the man's survival. They came with torches, or with lists of instructions, or with questions he could not answer. The man learned to listen carefully, to anticipate danger, to remain calm even when the world seemed determined to crush him. In many ways, the cage became both his sanctuary and his battlefield. It limited him, yes, but it also gave him space to think, to observe, to outlast the people who believed they had power over him. I imagine the evenings were the hardest. When the sun dipped behind the rooftops and shadows grew long, the world outside quieted, and the man faced himself entirely. In those moments, he would reflect on everything he had seen, everyone he had met, every thought he had had since the day he entered the cage. Some nights, he must have wept. Some nights, he must have smiled at the absurdity of it all. And yet, each morning, he awoke again, greeted by the cries of merchants and children, by the curious gaze of strangers, by the relentless pulse of life beyond the bars. Through it all, he became a legend. Not because he did anything spectacular in the traditional sense, but because he endured. He survived what most people would not, and in surviving, he left a mark on the town, on history, and perhaps even on the people who came to see him. He was a lesson without words, a demonstration of resilience, a reminder that humanity can persist even in the strangest, most confining circumstances. And so the cage remained his home, not merely a prison but a stage upon which a life unfolded, a life full of thought, observation, and quiet rebellion. I think about him often, wondering what he would say to someone like me, sitting at the edge of history, piecing together fragments of a story that refuses to be forgotten. Perhaps he would smile, perhaps he would laugh quietly, perhaps he would offer a riddle I could never solve. The man in the cage taught that even in confinement, one could live fully. Even when stripped of ordinary freedom, one could retain dignity, curiosity, and a sense of wonder. And in that, I see something extraordinary, a life lived not just to survive, but to endure, to witness, and to leave a mark that lasts longer than the bars that held him. He was not just a man in a cage, he became a mirror for everyone who came to see him. People stared, laughed, whispered, and sometimes cried, but few understood what he truly was. I try to imagine standing there as a child, peering through the cold bars, and sensing that there was something more alive inside him than outside. The stories claim that he could read people as if they were open books. Merchants with secrets, children with wild imaginations, soldiers with hidden fears, all of them were visible to him in ways that made him both frightening and fascinating. He knew when someone lied. He knew when someone was kind. And he knew, above all, that the world was a strange place full of contradictions, cruelty, and fleeting moments of beauty. The town grew around the cage. Markets thrived, roads were paved, buildings expanded, and yet the man remained fixed in the center of it all. Over the years, he became less of a person and more of a symbol. People began to say he represented endurance, patience, and the endurance of the human spirit. Some said he represented punishment, a reminder that knowledge or curiosity could be dangerous. But the truth, I think, was that he represented both at once. He was the living question of what it meant to be human, to endure, to observe, to feel, even when every convenience of life was denied. He also became part of the town's unspoken agreements. Everyone knew that they were being watched, in a way. Not just by rulers, not just by priests, but by the man in the cage. He remembered faces, gestures, promises, betrayals. The guards and the people alike felt it, though no one admitted it openly. Some say that rulers would come secretly to the cage, asking questions he did not answer, hoping for guidance they would never publicly acknowledge. Some visitors claimed he predicted events before they happened, noticing small details in people's behavior that no one else could see. If that was true, then he wasn't just a man trapped in iron, he was a kind of living oracle, forced into a prison by fear and misunderstanding. The boy who left drawings and the old woman who left herbs were not alone. Others came quietly, leaving small tokens that no one else noticed. A merchant once left a tiny compass, a scholar left scraps of parchment with strange diagrams, and a child left a folded paper bird that the man carefully unfolded and set aside. I imagine him examining each gift, not just out of curiosity, but as a way to connect to the outside world, to maintain some fragile link to life beyond the bars. These gestures may have seemed small, but they were powerful. They allowed him to survive not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. He also observed the seasons with a strange attentiveness. Spring brought the scent of flowers and the laughter of children running barefoot. Summer brought the scorching heat that made the iron bars almost unbearable, though he endured it. Autumn brought falling leaves and quiet reflection. Winter brought bitter winds and the chill of isolation. He learned to read the weather, to predict storms, and to notice the patterns in the sky. Some say he even spoke to the birds that came to rest on the bars, though whether they understood him is unknown. These small observations kept his mind alive, a way of understanding the world even from within a confined space. The longer he lived in the cage, the more people began to tell stories about him. My favorite story, though I can't verify if it's true, says that one day a ruler came to the town to see him and asked, "Why do you remain here? Do you not wish for freedom?" The man did not answer immediately. He simply stared at the ruler, calm and unafraid. Finally, he spoke, "I am free, though these bars may say otherwise. You cannot measure freedom with iron." The ruler supposedly left in silence, both impressed and unnerved. I like to think it is true, because it shows that the man's spirit was never truly imprisoned, even if his body was. There are also darker tales. Some nights, soldiers would come with orders to punish or interrogate him, sometimes under the claim that he had angered powerful people. On those nights, he would remain still, unmoving, and somehow survive. Some say he had learned to make himself invisible, not in the sense of disappearing, but in the sense of not giving the world a reason to harm him. He had mastered endurance, observation, and quiet resistance. He had become untouchable in a way no one expected. But life in the cage was not just observation and endurance. He had dreams, too. Some stories claim that at night he would close his eyes and imagine walking through forests, swimming in rivers, or lying under wide open skies without walls to confine him. Other nights, he imagined meeting people who understood him fully, who saw him as he truly was and not as a curiosity. These dreams were private, unseen by the guards or the townspeople, but they were real. They were a way for him to remain whole, to keep some piece of his spirit unbroken despite the limitations of his body. His resilience inspired some of the townspeople to act in secret. Children would bring small pieces of bread, messages, or drawings. Adults would leave water or blankets during winter. These acts of kindness were small, almost invisible, but they mattered immensely to him. He received them silently, appreciating the gestures without words, storing them as treasures in his mind. In some ways, the cage became less of a prison because of these small acts of human connection. They were reminders that he was still part of the world, that people could care even when society had locked him away. There were even reports that he tried to teach those who visited. He would offer riddles, tell strange stories, and pose questions that made people uncomfortable. Some claimed that if you listened carefully, you could understand truths about life that you had never noticed before. but most people didn't stay long enough to listen, or they were too busy laughing or staring. I like to imagine that his teaching was subtle, a whisper in the chaos of the town, something only the patient or the curious could catch. Time passed, and the man became a legend in his own lifetime. He was no longer just a man in a cage, he was history in motion, a living reminder that human endurance could surpass expectation. Generations grew up with his presence in the square, and the cage became an inseparable part of the town's identity. People who had never seen him in life would hear stories about him, each one growing stranger and more awe-inspiring with time. And even though the cage limited his body, it could not limit the mark he left on the imagination of everyone who came near it. At night, I imagine him staring at the stars, remembering his travels, remembering the people who had been kind, remembering the sky beyond the bars. I imagine him thinking about freedom in ways that no one else could understand, about life in ways that no one else could teach. And I imagine that, despite the iron around him, he felt a strange joy, a quiet defiance that no wall could destroy. He became more than a figure in a cage, he became a story that breathed, that shifted with every witness who came to see him. Over the years, the crowd changed, but the fascination never faded. Young men and women who had grown up hearing tales of the cage now brought their own children, pointing toward the man and whispering, "That is the one who survived, the one who saw too much." I think about what it must have been like to hear generations speak of you as though you were both present and myth. The man had no choice but to absorb it all, to live while being the object of curiosity, fear, admiration, and sometimes, contempt. One of the strangest aspects of his existence was the way people tried to interact with him. Scholars arrived with notebooks, asking questions about distant lands or curious phenomena. Artists came to sketch his image, hoping to capture the peculiar dignity he carried even when trapped. And storytellers. They told tales of his cleverness, of his endurance, of the riddles he posed that could confound the wisest of minds. He would listen quietly, sometimes correcting a detail, sometimes offering a small, knowing smile, but never revealing the full measure of his understanding. I like to think he enjoyed their visits, not for their company, but for the way they reminded him that the world outside the cage still moved and that he still had a role in it. There were nights when the cage seemed less like iron and more like a stage, a theater for the small dramas of human life. I read accounts of a traveling musician who came and played a soft melody beneath the cage. The man listened intently, swaying slightly to the rhythm, and when the musician left, he supposedly tapped out a silent rhythm on the bars, a small conversation of sound and gesture. On other nights, a poet would recite verses aloud, and the man would whisper corrections or add lines in a voice that was barely audible. Even in silence, he influenced the people around him, a quiet power born from patience and observation rather than force. Yet there was darkness, too. The town was not always kind, and some rulers grew impatient with the spectacle. Orders came occasionally to move him, to punish him, even to end his life. I can only imagine the fear he must have felt in those moments, though outwardly, he remained calm. He had learned the rhythms of survival, to anticipate, to endure, to make the right gesture at the right moment. Some nights, the guards whispered that he had a strange way of seeing through plans and schemes, and that no one could act against him without his knowledge. Whether that was true or just legend, it spoke to the aura he carried, a man who was caged physically, but somehow untouchable in spirit. I think about his loneliness often. There is no escaping solitude when every hour is marked by bars and by watching eyes. But he found ways to fill that emptiness. He studied the sun, the clouds, the stars, and the small creatures that wandered near his cage. He watched humans with keen attention, learning their habits, their fears, and their small kindnesses. He kept silent journals, though no one ever saw them, and through his observations, he created a private world that no iron could restrict. I imagine that world vividly, a place where freedom existed not in the absence of walls, but in the mind that refused to be constrained. Over time, he began to understand the strange power he held over the town. People believed they controlled him by keeping him in a cage, but he understood that he controlled their attention, their imaginations, and even their behavior. Merchants timed their work around visiting hours, children dared each other to approach, soldiers checked his presence as part of their routine, and rulers pondered the lessons he might offer without ever admitting it. He became a center of gravity, not through force or wealth, but through a quiet, persistent existence that demanded acknowledgement. The boy who once left drawings grew older and returned as a young man. He brought books, carefully hidden, hoping the man would read them, and I imagine the joy in discovering new knowledge, new ideas, and the thrill of mental companionship without words. The old woman, too, continued her visits until she could no longer walk to the square, leaving herbs and bread in small, hidden places. I imagine the man saving these gifts, cherishing them like treasures, and smiling at the evidence that, even in isolation, kindness endured. Some nights, the man would speak to the stars, whispering secrets, asking questions, or simply naming the places he had seen and the people he had met. Legends claim that travelers from distant lands followed the stars and somehow heard whispers carried by the wind. Whether this was true or not, it gives a sense of his reach beyond iron, beyond the town, beyond even what anyone could see. The cage was a prison, yes, but also a bridge, connecting him to a world that extended far beyond the square. I often think about how he must have reflected on time itself. Centuries would pass in memory, though only decades ticked by outside. He would see children grow into adults and then vanish, parents age and disappear, rulers change. Yet, he remained, a silent observer of life's relentless cycle. Some nights, I imagine him tracing the patterns of history in the dirt beneath him, plotting human folly, marveling at courage, and occasionally shaking his head at cruelty. In those moments, he was not just a prisoner, he was a witness, a recorder, a living archive of everything the town experienced. And through it all, he retained a quiet sense of humor. Stories claim he would sometimes make the guards or visitors blush with clever remarks, jokes that could slip past ordinary understanding. Humor, I think, was his shield and his companion, a way to assert agency in a world that had tried to deny him it. He could laugh at the absurdity of people, the absurdity of rules, and the absurdity of his own confinement. That laughter, however quiet or hidden, became another form of survival. The man in the cage was also a teacher, whether the town realized it or not. His endurance taught patience. His observation taught awareness. His quiet defiance taught that freedom is more than physical space. I think that is why the stories endured, not because of cruelty inflicted upon him, but because of the lessons he embodied simply by being alive. People came to see him, but they left carrying more than curiosity, they carried the imprint of a life fully endured, despite circumstance. Sometimes I imagine myself standing before him, asking questions I cannot yet answer, listening to his quiet wisdom, and hoping that he would see me as more than another spectator. Perhaps he would, perhaps he would not. But the truth is, his story is not just about the man, it is about anyone who learns to find strength, connection, and meaning even when surrounded by walls. And that is why, even centuries later, his legend continues, because the lessons he taught are timeless, because the courage of the human spirit cannot be contained entirely by iron and stone. As the years wore on, the man in the cage began to change in ways that no one could entirely see. The guards and visitors noticed subtleties: the way his gaze lingered longer on certain faces, the quiet intensity of his gestures, the thoughtful pauses before he spoke. Some claimed he was becoming wiser, others whispered that he was becoming something beyond human, a figure who had transcended ordinary life simply through endurance and observation. The truth, I suspect, was more subtle. He was becoming a repository of history, memory, and insight, living proof that the human spirit could adapt even to the strangest circumstances. One day, an event occurred that altered everything. A new ruler arrived in the town, a young man ambitious and eager to make his mark. He had heard of the man in the cage, of the legends surrounding him, and he demanded an audience. The town trembled. People feared that this ruler, untested and brash, might act hastily, that he might see the man's confinement as an annoyance to be removed rather than a story to be respected. The man in the cage, however, showed no fear. He waited, quiet and still, as the ruler approached with guards and advisors. The ruler circled the cage, inspecting every angle, his eyes sharp and calculating. He asked questions, testing the man's knowledge of geography, history, and people. The man answered, not with haste or brashness, but with careful, deliberate insight. He spoke of places he had seen, of events he had witnessed, of human behaviors that repeated like patterns in a vast tapestry. The ruler was both impressed and unnerved. He demanded more, wanting secrets, predictions, explanations. But the man remained calm, offering answers that were truthful yet incomplete, lessons wrapped in riddles and observation. It was during this encounter that something remarkable happened. The ruler, frustrated by the man's restraint, threatened to extend his confinement, to make the cage more restrictive, to punish him for silence. And yet, the man did not shrink or tremble. Instead, he demonstrated an extraordinary quiet power. He asked the ruler to look closer, not at him, but at the people outside the cage, at the town, at the patterns of life he had observed for years. He pointed out subtleties that no one had noticed, the way the merchants timed their trade, the hidden acts of kindness, the rhythm of human interaction. The ruler, for the first time, realized that the man's confinement had not diminished him, it had made him the town's invisible center, a witness to all that mattered. From that day on, the man's role subtly shifted. He became more than an object of curiosity, he became a guide, a living archive of the town's life. Scholars came more frequently, hoping to glean wisdom from his words. Artists lingered longer, trying to capture not just his image, but the essence of someone who had endured decades of observation and reflection. Travelers from distant towns came to see him, curious not merely about his physical confinement, but about the way a life could unfold within such narrow limits and still exert influence far beyond itself. Even as his reputation grew, the man never lost touch with the small things that kept him human. He still listened to the wind and the rain, still watched the birds and animals that wandered near the cage. He still responded to the gestures of the boy who had grown into a young man, leaving drawings, books, and small notes tucked carefully between the bars. And he still appreciated the old woman's quiet acts of kindness, which she continued to leave near the cage long after age had slowed her steps. These small connections were his lifeline, a reminder that life existed beyond iron, that kindness endured even when cruelty persisted. But with recognition came danger. Not everyone admired the man's endurance or insight. Some saw him as a threat, someone whose knowledge and patience could undermine authority. Rumors began to circulate that the man held secrets that could destabilize rulers or expose hidden corruption. Certain groups petitioned for stricter confinement or removal altogether. There were nights when soldiers would arrive, checking the bars, testing his strength, ensuring that he remained physically restrained. And yet, despite these threats, he survived. He endured. His calm, measured presence seemed to shield him, as if the cage itself had become a sanctuary that protected him from forces outside. One particularly harsh winter, the town faced famine. The streets emptied, merchants closed their stalls, and fear settled like a fog over the square. Many wondered if the man could survive, if the cold and hunger would finally break him. But he adapted. He rationed the meager supplies brought by guards or sympathetic townspeople. He used his knowledge of observation and endurance to predict weather changes, to make small adjustments that ensured his survival. And when spring finally returned, he remained, unchanged in his resolve, a living testament to resilience. It was during these challenging times that the man's quiet acts became most apparent. Children would secretly leave small portions of food, travelers would drop coins, and even the most distant merchants found ways to contribute. No one could be sure he received these gifts, but he did, quietly, without fanfare. He preserved the kindness, storing it in memory and spirit, reinforcing the lessons he silently taught, that even in adversity, connection, patience, and human empathy endure. The man also began to engage with ideas more actively. I imagine him reading scraps of parchment, listening carefully to visitors' questions, and offering insights that sometimes seemed ahead of his time. He spoke of philosophy, of human nature, of patterns in society that repeated endlessly. Some scholars left frustrated, unable to grasp the depth of his observations. Others returned repeatedly, hoping to learn a fragment of wisdom that could only be understood by someone who had lived so long in quiet observation. In this way, the cage had transformed him. It limited his body but expanded his mind, turning him into a teacher without classrooms, a philosopher without a podium. And yet, despite all this, the man never sought freedom in the ordinary sense. He did not plot escape, nor did he plead for release. His understanding of life seemed to extend beyond the physical. Perhaps, by enduring, he had achieved a form of liberation that most could never understand, a freedom of thought, a sovereignty of spirit that no iron bar could contain. The cage remained a boundary, yes, but not a limitation. It framed his life, but it did not define it. Through all the challenges, the man became a legend, not just for surviving, but for demonstrating the remarkable endurance of the human spirit. The townspeople, scholars, travelers, and even rulers carried stories of him far and wide, blending truth and myth, admiration and fear, wonder and disbelief. He was a man who had lived and endured, who had found meaning in isolation, and who had quietly taught the world that resilience could be as powerful as strength, that observation could be more instructive than action, and that life, even when confined, could leave an indelible mark. Over time, whispers began to spread that the man in the cage was more than he appeared. Some claimed he had come from distant lands, from places no one in the town had ever seen, bringing knowledge and experience that seemed impossible to acquire in a single lifetime. Others said he had once been part of a secret society, a group that sought to observe human behavior, record history, and uncover truths too dangerous to reveal openly. Whether these stories were true or simply the embellishments of curious minds, they added a layer of mystery to his existence, and I could almost imagine the boy in me listening to these tales, heart pounding with excitement, yearning to know the truth. I imagine that he remembered a life before the cage, though none of the townspeople knew it. Perhaps he had wandered through forests, across rivers, and over mountains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Perhaps he had met people who spoke in strange tongues, who practiced customs so different from his own that he had to learn, adapt, and survive. Those experiences, hidden behind the bars, shaped him, teaching patience, observation, and a profound understanding of human nature. And now, confined to the cage, he carried those memories silently, a treasure trove of wisdom that only he could access, and that he revealed in small, deliberate ways to those who truly listened. The cage itself had become almost sacred, in a strange way. People began to treat it not only as a prison but as a monument, a reminder of endurance, of patience, and of mystery. Travelers from distant lands arrived, sometimes carrying letters of inquiry, sometimes just curiosity, hoping to see the man who had captivated generations. They brought gifts, manuscripts, and strange objects, hoping to catch a glimpse of knowledge they could not otherwise obtain. Some visitors claimed the man could predict events, sometimes weeks or months in advance, simply by observing human behavior. Others said he could sense danger before it arrived, a sixth sense honed by years of careful watching and deep thought. I like to imagine the man reflecting on all this. He must have understood how much of his life had become legend, how people interpreted his actions and words in ways he never intended. Perhaps he even found amusement in it, imagining the stories that would be told long after he was gone. And yet, despite the growing mythos around him, he remained grounded in the simple realities of daily life: the birds that visited, the children who left drawings, the old woman who brought bread and herbs, the rhythms of the sun and the moon, and the endless cycle of seasons. Sometimes he must have thought about the people who had put him in the cage, about the rulers who feared knowledge, about those who sought to control what they could not understand. Perhaps he felt anger or sorrow, perhaps resignation, perhaps a combination of both. And yet, he never lost his humanity. He remained curious, patient, and observant, finding beauty in the smallest details: the pattern of a leaf, the flight of a bird, the laughter of a child. I imagine that these small moments became his sustenance, more vital than the bread and water delivered each day. Then came moments of tension, rare but intense. There were nights when soldiers arrived unexpectedly, sometimes to interrogate, sometimes to threaten. The man would endure silently, listening to their commands, watching their expressions, understanding the world beyond his cage more than they understood him. On some occasions, he spoke, carefully choosing words that conveyed wisdom without giving away the depth of his knowledge. These encounters became lessons for those who watched, though few realized it. The man taught patience, composure, and resilience simply by existing in a world that tried to limit him. As years passed, the man's legend began to attract more intellectual minds: philosophers, scholars, and naturalists who wanted to study him, learn from him, or at least witness his unique existence. Some asked questions that challenged his understanding of morality, ethics, and the nature of freedom. Others probed for secrets about history, human behavior, or the hidden world. The man answered selectively, carefully choosing which truths to reveal, and in doing so, he became a teacher without a classroom, a philosopher without a podium, a historian without books. His cage became both a stage and a sanctuary, the center of observation for those who sought knowledge and the shield that protected him from intrusion. Yet, despite all this attention, he maintained a quiet mystery. No one knew where he had truly come from, and many speculated wildly. Some claimed he was a traveler from a distant kingdom, exiled for knowing too much. Others whispered that he had been chosen by some secret council to live in observation, to record human behavior across decades. A few even said he possessed a kind of subtle magic, an ability to influence events simply by existing, by watching, and by speaking when necessary. The truth was probably simpler, though no less remarkable: he was a man who had endured, who had observed, and who had lived fully, despite confinement. And in the quiet moments, when the square was empty and only the wind moved through the streets, the man would close his eyes and remember his past, the vast landscapes he had traversed, the people he had met, the lessons he had learned. He would imagine the world beyond the cage, not with bitterness or longing, but with understanding. In some ways, the cage had given him a perspective no ordinary life could provide, a perspective shaped by patience, endurance, and observation. He had become both observer and participant, witness and teacher, prisoner and philosopher. The man's legacy, even in his own lifetime, was growing. People came not just to stare, but to learn, to reflect, to find in him an example of human endurance and insight. They left carrying stories, lessons, and small fragments of wisdom that the man had shared quietly, without fanfare. And though he remained physically confined, his mind and spirit roamed freely, connecting with everyone who truly listened and observed. The cage, once meant to imprison him, had become the frame of a life fully observed, fully lived, and fully understood in ways that few could comprehend.